Welcome back, everyone. Today, David and I will be talking about Psalm 5. Now, Psalm 5 is what is called a Psalm of Lament.
A Psalm of Lament is, broadly speaking, a psalm in which the writer cries out to God for help. And there are typically 5 key parts to a Psalm of Lament. The first is an invocation in which the psalmist makes it clear that they're calling on God specifically. Second is a complaint, and that's the part where the psalmist says particularly what is wrong. Third is a petition in which the psalmist says what they want God to do about the problem. Fourth comes an expression of trust, which is exactly what it sounds like. And then finally, there are typically words of praise toward the conclusion of a psalm, praising God for who he is and what he's done. And so when we look at Psalm 5, we can see that all of those elements are pretty clearly in different verses.
It's interesting because I've never thought of structuring my prayers as a lament, but it seems like those 5 things you mentioned are things that are often parts of personal prayers when we are facing a hard time, telling God what's wrong and what we want him to do about it, hopefully expressions of trust and praise and so on.
Very, very much so, Caroline. The Psalms of Lament may come across as formal poetry, but there are themes and emotions that they express which are very much part of our day-to-day lives. This psalm, for instance, talks about enemies, and while we might not have enemies exactly like David, I know there are times when we face adversarial situations and have problems that feel as significant as those of David. And in those moments, the way the Psalms talk about enemies can be a great spiritual resource for us.
In those sorts of situations, it can be comforting to see the emotion expressed in the Psalms, like this one. The psalmist is not afraid to bring these issues up to God, not afraid to show emotion or to talk about some really profound struggles and fears. It seems like the emotions we encounter, even the ones that we would think of as negative or the ones we'd be tempted to hide, those all come out in the Psalms.
Furthermore, these emotions don't have to be just about our own personal enemies. To find ourselves connecting with them, there are times when I look at problems and evil in the world outside of my own personal circumstances, and I have to remind myself that God's justice actually does prevail in the end, even if I don't see it in that particular moment.
So true. If you look at the psalm, you can clearly see that the psalmist has a certain understanding of who God is. God is just, God hates evil, and so on. So the psalmist has this understanding, but then he's seeing things in his life or in the world that don't seem to line up with it. He knows that God is just, and he's seeing people doing evil and seemingly get away with it. It doesn't seem to make sense.
Yeah, exactly. And though the psalmist doesn't directly say this, you do get the sense that all of this is making him wrestle with some of those doubts that we face, the kinds of doubts that still make sense today, such as how could God be actually good and just, and yet we still have enemies and all kinds of major problems that we see all throughout the world.
What I love about the psalmist's response to that is that he chooses faith. He declares that he is going to continue following God and worshiping him even before he asks God to intervene and punish evildoers and to bring joy to the righteous. He clearly makes a conscious choice that he is going to follow God no matter what. And that consciously chosen trust, in that, he asks God to act. And then he ends up by praising God. There's this great quote by Oswald Chambers about this. And he says, "Faith is deliberate confidence in the character of God, whose ways you may not understand at the time."
I think that deliberate confidence in the character of God is so much of what makes Psalm 5 a powerful psalm for devotional and prayer use. It shows us that we can, in fact, choose faith in the face of doubts, not just ignoring our doubts, but making a choice in the middle of those doubts because, just like David, the author of the psalm, we know God's character. As the psalmist says in verse 8, he says, "Lead me, O Lord, in your righteousness, because my enemies. Make your way straight before me." And in the midst of the psalmist's uncertainty and doubt, you see, he still asks God to lead him in righteousness.
It's like David is asking God to make it clear to him what faithfully following God in his specific circumstances would look like. Like he's doing his best to follow God and just asking God to make it work.
Exactly. And so we do hope that you enjoy this time together, and we do hope that you learn to use this psalm as a reminder of God's character, even in the midst of struggle, doubt, or any kind of affliction. We hope you have a great time.